Today we're taking a look at one of the greatest games ever played between two players who have shared what is perhaps the most notorious chess rivalry of all time. I am of course talking about Hans Niemann and Magnus Carlsen, who in the game you are about to see tear into each other with uncompromising aggression and resolve, both going straight for the throat. You're going to see Magnus make a shocking sacrificial decision, hell-bent on creating complications, which Hans Niemann manages to navigate with virtually flawless precision until he doesn't, and eventually crumbles under the relentless endgame pressure that Magnus is so famous for. So this one's amazing and highly instructive. It's a rapid game from the 2022 Air Things Masters Preliminaries. Hans Niemann is Team White, and he kicks this rager off with c4, the English opening. And from Magnus we get a relatively uncommon response, g6. This is known as the Great Snake variation, which according to my sources was given that name because sometimes black will end up putting his pawns on f5, e5, and d6, resulting in a structure that is supposed to look like a snake. Although it's much more common to see this opening transpose into a King's Indian, where d6 and knight to f6 are played, or into a Grunfeld with an eventual d5, or what happens in this game where sort of an English structure is maintained, with knight to c3, c5, knight to f3, bishop to g7, and now e3 from Hans. Looking to build him a big center with d4 next, Magnus plays knight to f6, Hans plays his d4, and now we have a very prudent response from Magnus. C takes d4, following the very general principle that says to trade your less central pawns for your opponent's more central pawns. And so after the recapture, Magnus still has his two most central e and d pawns, whereas Hans only has his d pawn. And here black is faced with an important decision. Will he now stake his claim in the center with the move d5 while he still has the chance? Or will he do what Magnus does now and simply castle? Both moves are quite fine and playable, but after d5 from Hans, there is no more d5 available to black, and so he has no choice but to try to make the argument that white's d5 expansion is nothing to fear, unless of course he wants to admit fault, which you should never do in chess, at least not with your moves anyway, unless of course you have no choice. But Magnus stands by his decision and strikes at that d-pawn right away with e6. He wants to make the case that white has overextended himself, and this is a very interesting move since it invites d6, just further invading the black camp. Hans didn't play this, but I think a lot of players, including myself, would be just a bit uneasy about allowing this as black. But it's actually quite harmless and even favors black a bit, who can just very easily play around it with moves like b6, bishop to b7, knight to c6, or even knight to a6. And what is that pawn on d6 even doing? Supporting a knight getting to c7 via b5? Well, that's actually no problem for black, as long as he doesn't let his rook get trapped on a8, of course, since if nothing else, he can just play knight to e8 at any moment to challenge that knight on c7, which cannot be maintained on that invasive post. So this is a perfect example of how infiltrating your opponent's camp without the proper support and with no significant threats is not necessarily of any value in and of itself. But Hans doesn't take the bait, and in the game, leaves his d-pawn where it is and simply develops with bishop to e2, which is the correct square for the bishop as it blocks the e-file, which Magnus now opens with e takes d5, since after c takes d5, there's no rook to e8 with a check, as there would have been if white had moved his light squared bishop to a different square. Magnus now plays d6, opening the diagonal for his light squared bishop, as well as the d7 square for his knight. We now have h3, which I am assuming is to restrict Magnus's light squared bishop, which Hans probably thinks Magnus would be willing to trade off with bishop to g4, followed by bishop takes f3 if necessary. But now that bishop doesn't have a great square. On d7, it would just be getting in the way of the knight, which wants to go to d7. If you move it to f5, then there's the danger of it being trapped, starting with g4, once knight to d7 is played. But this is no big problem for black. Magnus just plays rook to e8, and after Hans castles, he continues knight b to d7, just putting the development of his light squared bishop on the back burner for now. His knight's not stuck on d7 or anything, it's got places to go, maybe to c5, hop into e4, then bishop to d7 can be played. So black is doing just fine here. Hans now plays bishop to e3, just some natural development, and here I would ask you to pause the video and find the best move. If Magnus Carlsen's next move was the best move, but it's actually not necessarily objectively best, but I really like it anyway, because it doesn't lose, and it's very dangerous, and it creates an imbalance, which is what you want to do if you're trying to play for a win. And I think it just might have come as a bit of a shock to Hans Niemann, since if he thought it was any good, he could have just easily avoided it by moving his bishop somewhere else, like to f4 or g5, both very decent moves. But with the bishop sitting on e3, Magnus now has the opportunity to execute a stunning sacrifice of the exchange with rook takes e3, which on the surface is a bit baffling, since after f takes e3 from Hans, where is black's compensation? Well, there is the weak backward pawn on e3 that can be targeted with Magnus's follow-up, queen to e7. There's also now a hole on e4 that black can potentially occupy with the piece. He's got the bishop pair, whereas white's bishop is kind of bad, being hindered by this pawn on d5, which is blocking a couple of its best diagonals. But does this really justify white sacrificing 2 whole pawns worth of material? Well, apparently it does, since after this move queen to e7 from Magnus, Stockfish, after some deep analysis, does eventually conclude that there is no significant advantage for either side, and is giving the move queen to d2 to temporarily defend e3. But Hans doesn't play that because he knows that there's no great way to hang on to that e3 pawn after bishop to h6, hitting the pawn again, when the only halfway decent way to add defense is going to be knight to d1. King to f2, of course, would just be foolhardy, as kings generally should not move towards centers of boards. But here, after knight to b6, how are you saving the d-pawn? You're not. So black is going to have no trouble grabbing at least one pawn for the exchange, one way or the other, which is why in the game, after queen to e7, Hans just plays king to h2, inviting Magnus to play queen takes e3, which will now not come with the check. But Magnus declines the pawn, since if he were to capture it, then Hans could simply respond queen to d2, when Magnus would have to choose between a queen trade, which is not ideal when you're still a bit down in material, or he could expend another tempo, moving his queen a second time, maybe to somewhere like b6. So if what they say is true about a typical pawn being worth about 3 tempi, then it would make sense that this unhealthy pawn on e3 might be roughly equal in value to the 2 tempi black has to expend to both capture it and avoid the trade of queens, which would explain why the engine has no strong opinions about its capture one way or the other, and says black could take it or leave it. Magnus chooses to leave it with the move knight to c5, prioritizing piece activity over the immediate reduction in material inequality. We have queen to d2 from Hans, mainly to just develop his queen, although it does defend e3 for the moment. Play continues bishop to d7 and bishop to d3 from Hans, which is a very good move, clearing the way for a rook to defend the e-pawn, supporting a possible push to e4, and spoiler alert, maybe an eventual push to e5. Bishop to d3 also discourages black from putting a knight on e4, since that would give white the chance to trade off his rather bad light squared bishop with bishop takes e4. That's not ideal, and of course Hans has no problem with Magnus playing knight takes d3, but instead he goes for the very natural looking rook to e8, though his very best move, according to the engine, was the odd looking b5, looking to sack a pawn in order to gain even more control of that e4 outpost. And this leads to a complicated variation that I'm not going to get into, but suffice to say that it's quite convoluted and unclear to anyone who is not an engine, which despite everything I say, Magnus is not. He is most likely human, and as such, plays the much more human move rook to e8, which is also just fine, just increasing the pressure on e3. Hans responds rook a to e1, adding defense, supporting that e4 pawn thrust. We have bishop to h6 from Magnus, threatening bishop takes e3, which would come with an attack on the white queen. Hans decides he doesn't want to give away that pawn anymore. It's got better prospects now, and so he plays b4, which is a good way to defend the pawn, since if Magnus were to play knight takes d3, then after queen takes d3, bishop takes e3 no longer comes with an attack on the white queen, meaning that knight to d1 is a bit of a problem for black. Not because the bishop's pinned, black does have bishop to f4 check, but after king to g1, the black queen is still hit. If you try queen to d8, then there's queen to d4 with a double attack. So knight to e4 is probably the best try, but then white will just increase the pressure with knight to c3. and then he can double the rooks. Black does have f5, so he's not going to be losing a piece, but white will at least get his pawn back with a much superior position. So Magnus avoids this losing line, and instead responds to Hans's b4 with knight c to e4, giving Hans the chance to trade off that bad bishop, which he does now with bishop takes e4. Magnus, of course, recaptures with the knight, attacking the white queen, and best here is probably just to capture again on e4, but Hans decides to go for queen to d4. Not really sure why. I mean, he is threatening to force a trade of queens with queen takes e4, which would be winning for white at this point, but Magnus just plays knight takes c3, and after queen takes c3, he wisely continues to resist the temptation to capture on e3. He's got no interest in walking into that self-pin, and so continues bishop to b5, attacking the rook. It goes to f2, at which point Magnus misses his best move, and it's actually his only good move. Pause the video and see if you can play better than Magnus Carlsen, if even for only one move. Here it is. The move Black now needs to play is queen to e4, keeping White's central pawns disconnected, attacking d5, which White has no great way to hang on to. I'll just show you one attempt, queen to d4. Here we have bishop to c4, just hitting the pawn again. And how are you going to add defense? The e1 rook is defending e3. If rook to d2, then there's queen takes d4, rook takes d4, and bishop takes a2, which is just fine for Black. He's got the two bishops. White's e-pawn is still weak. White could try rook to a1 here, but he's not going to trap the bishop, and this again neglects the defensive e3. So this position is roughly equal, but in the game, Magnus does not realize that queen to e4 is necessary, and instead goes for bishop to g7, which comes with a one-move threat to the white queen, but after queen to c2, taking control of e4, if Black now plays queen to e4, then the queens are going to get traded, the white rook is going to take over the c-file. That's no happy trail for Black. So Magnus, no longer having any good way to stop the move e4, in what is now a losing position, decides to try h5. Maybe he's thinking if he can get in g5 and then g4, he can cause some disruption to the white king's position. Hans responds a4, which although aggressive is not very accurate, and actually gives up much if not all of Black's winning advantage, as it pushes the bishop back to d7, where it now supports the move rook to c8, which will come with tempo on the white queen. So he's just helped Magnus get his rook onto the open file. Instead of a4, Hans should have just played e4, which is what he plays now, but after rook to c8 from Magnus, Hans has a bit of a dilemma, as his queen is the sole defender of his pawn on a4, which is attacked by the bishop. If he plays queen to d1, then there's bishop to c3 with a double attack, picking up the b-pawn. So Hans decides to go for queen to b3, which is not a good move. You'll see why in a moment. It turns out that queen to d3 is actually best, just letting that pawn fall to bishop takes a4, because now you got rook to a2. And one way or another, Black is going to lose his pawn on a7 unless he plays b5. But that would actually be worse, leaving his bishop sidelined over here on a4 with very limited prospects for further participation in the game. But now let's take a look at Hans's move, which is queen to b3. This is not ideal since it allows Magnus to play rook to c3, attacking the queen again. Hans plays queen to d1, maintaining that defensive a4. And you might think that this looks superior to putting the queen to d1 on the previous move, since now Black doesn't have that move bishop to c3, but the rook on c3 is actually more dangerous in light of Magnus's best continuation, which begins with the move g5, threatening g4, kicking the knight, and then g3 with a deadly fork, only made possible because of the c3 rook's lateral protection. So for that reason, g5 is best here for Black. It's not winning or anything, White does have things he can do, but the position has pretty much returned to equilibrium. But after rook to c4 from Magnus, which looks good, attacking a couple pawns, Hans is able to again seize the advantage with the very strong move e5. Looking for e6, that would not be good, so Magnus grabs the pawn with d takes e5. It is his best move, but now Hans has d6, with an attack on the black queen by his shiny new passed pawn, which is but 2 steps away from the promotion square. So this is well worth the loss of his pawn on e5, Magnus continues queen to f6, threatening to play e4, which would win that f3 knight since it is now pinned to the rook. And this position is getting pretty complicated. White has several options here, including just taking on e5 with the rook, but then black has rook to c6, attacking the d6 pawn, and if that's defended, there's queen to f4 check, picking up the b pawn. The engine says that that line leads to equality, despite the fact that white gets to hang on to his passed pawn, at least for the moment. There's also the move king to g1, which is actually the engine's top choice as it defends the rook on f2 and so threatens a discovery on the black queen with knight takes e5. So black should respond rook to f4, and this leads into another rather crazy engine line that Stockfish initially thinks is really promising for white, but the longer it analyzes, the more it starts to think that black will have no problem holding the draw, so I'm not going to get into that. The move Hans plays is queen to d5, which is decent, hitting a lot of key squares, e5, b7, the rook on c4, but after rook to c6 from Magnus, that pawn on d6 is going away, and if white tries to add defense with rook f to d2, then there's bishop to f8, increasing the pressure, and the pawn will drop off. So Hans just takes on e5, it's as good a move as any. We have queen takes d6, queen takes d6, rook takes d6, and now knight to g5 targeting f7. Bishop to f6 blocks that with an attack on the knight. Hans continues knight to e4 with the fork, which looks very bad for black until you realize he has bishop to e5 check, now played by Magnus. The king goes to h1, we have rook to d4 targeting b4. Hans defends with rook to d2, very nice. If rook takes b4, then of course rook takes d7 wins a piece. However, the a4 pawn is still hanging, and so we have bishop takes a4, officially bringing the game back to material equality. Magnus now has the two pawns for the exchange, but all roads lead to a likely draw, with best play from both sides. Hans didn't really have anything better than this line. A pair of rooks are now exchanged, and the one-move threats just keep coming with knight to d6, hitting b7, bishop to c3, attacking both rook and pawn, rook to e4 defends. Magnus secures his threatened b-pawn now with b5. We have a rook check on e8, king to g7, rook to e7, attacking f7. Magnus grabs the b-pawn, attacking the knight. Hans captures on f7 with check. The king goes to h6. The knight retreats to e4. a7 is attacked. It's pushed to a5. And this position is still objectively drawn, but I would not want to be white here. I mean, what a nightmare, having to deal with these connected passed pawns supported by the bishop duo. That's a recipe for disaster, but Hans continues to play very accurately now with the top engine move, h4. He's got his own threat brewing. Magnus plays bishop to b3, hitting the rook. It goes to a7. The pawn is pushed. It's starting to look very scary, but Hans knows what to do and continues with a beautiful move, g4. Threatening checkmate in one with g5. And black only has a couple good ways to prevent it. One is to play g5, which is apparently okay, but the more obvious move, now played by Magnus, is h takes g4, just grabbing another pawn, after which you might be wondering, what's the follow-up for white? Well, if you study this position for a few minutes, or for even a few seconds, you might just be able to work out what Hans plays next. It's the only move that doesn't lose, and that move is knight to f6, renewing the threat of checkmate with rook to h7. And there's very little black can do about it, as in there's only one good defense, and that is the move now played by Magnus, g5. You gotta give that king a square, and this is the only way to do it. But now what does white do? He's down in material, he's only got one pawn left, so what's the justification for this? Well, again, there's only one move that doesn't lose. Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot it. But that move, now played by Hans, is h5, achieving a passed pawn of his own and again threatening mate in one with rook to h7. So this is just a masterclass in how to create very severe threats with just a rook, a knight, and a pawn. These are excellent patterns to burn into your consciousness. Magnus only has one good defense here, and that is bishop to c2, covering h7. At which point Hans again has but a single move that doesn't lose. What do you think it is? Take a gander if you'd like. See if you can spot the only way to secure the draw for white. which is rook to a6, a move which Hans unfortunately did not play. The main threat here is knight to d5, discovered check, picking up the bishop on b4, so black's got to deal with that. The engine is giving bishop to a3, so let's have a look at that. White should now continue knight to e4 check. Now if the black king moves backwards to h7 or g7, which is what he should do, then you got moves like knight takes g5 and or h6 defended by the rook, with the knight supporting the pawn push to h7, which in combination with the potential to continue to harass the black king with lateral checks by the rook will result in enough counterplay to secure white the draw. And you can delve into the dirty details of that line on your own if you'd like, but I want to show you the most critical move, which of course is king takes h5. How is this not just losing for white? Well, it's because of a gorgeous mating threat that can now be executed with knight to g3 check. King to h4 is the only move, and now king to g2, defending the knight. And how as black are you preventing rook to h6 checkmate? You can sacrifice your bishop with bishop to e4 check, which may just be the best try, although the engine says it's hopeless. The only other option is bishop to f8, guarding that h6 square. But this does not solve the problem. Black's king is never going to escape his little prison here on h4. He can't move either of these pawns. He can't move the king since h5 is covered by the knight. So all white really needs to do is get his rook onto the h-file and it's over. And the engine actually gives mate in 6 here with the move rook to e6. Just simply threatening rook to e1 and then rook to h1 checkmate. And there is no defense. The dark squared bishop is tied down to defending against rook to h6. So I'll just show you the mate in 5 from here. The engine's giving a3, rook to e1, and now black can only delay mate as follows. Bishop to e4 check, rook takes e4, bishop to c5, rook to e1, bishop to g1, rook back to e6, and now after anything black plays, let's say a2, we have rook to h6 checkmate. So such a beautiful variation, not surprising that Hans didn't find this resource, the threat of which was the only way to save his game. But now let's take a look at what was played in the game. After bishop to c2 from Magnus, preventing rook to h7 mate, instead of that drawing move rook to a6, Hans tries king to g2, which is just losing after bishop to c3 from Magnus, attacking the knight. If it moves, then black just grabs the pawn on h5, and he's not getting mated. Knight to d5 here, attacking the bishop doesn't work because of bishop to e4 check. If white defends with rook to a6, then there's just going to be bishop takes knight, followed by king takes h5, when black's remaining bishop and 4 pawns are going to be way too much to deal with, and white is just hopelessly lost. Although that is probably his best try, but Hans now plays knight to g8 check, the h-pawn falls, and now we have rook to a6. Going for some last minute trickery, threatening that mate in 1 with rook to h6, he might as well, but Magnus is never falling for this, and he responds bishop to e4 check, and after king to g3, he's got bishop to e5 check, driving the white king backwards. Hans plays king to f2, but now here comes the g-pawn, to g3 with check. That pawn is unstoppable. If king to g1, then there's just bishop to d4 check, followed by g2, then promotion. Hans plays king to e3, but after g2 for Magnus, he can find no reason to continue the game, having no way to stop the promotion of that g-pawn on the next move, and so in this position, Hans Niemann submits his resignation, bringing to a close one of the most exciting encounters between these two, played at a time when the chess world was still primarily focused on their actual chess, and not on all the extraneous drama that would ignite the world in controversy later that very year. So I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. Please consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't already. Hit that like button if you liked the video, and feel free to leave a comment. All those things help out the channel, and I will see you next time.